I thought I was testing my granddaughter with a lie, but it turned out I was the one being tested. That night, the portrait of my daughter was slashed, and the one who did it was the child I abandoned 30 years ago. If you think this is just another family drama, you're completely wrong. Subscribe now so you won't miss more gripping stories like this one. Under the weight of the afternoon sun, the sprawling house on Queen Street sat, as it always had, quiet, dignified, full of stories that no one dared to ask about. Inside the walls held more than just Margaret Hale's paintings. They held the echoes of years spent in solitude, in brushstrokes, in loss. But today everything was going to change. Margaret stood in front of the tall, arched window of her studio, her fingertips stained with ochre and titanium white, staring not at the canvas, but at the reflection of herself. 72, the same age her mother had been when the dementia started. But Margaret's mind was sharp, too sharp in fact, sharp enough to sense the shifting energy in the house, sharp enough to know that love, especially familial, doesn't always arrive in a soft voice or a warm gesture. Sometimes it arrives masked, clever, calculated. She ran a hand over her cheek and looked back at the unfinished canvas behind her. A portrait of a girl. Not any specific girl. Not yet. The eyes were there, almost alive, and Margaret found herself unable to finish them. She hadn't touched it in weeks. Couldn't. Downstairs, Olivia moved like a shadow. She'd only been living with Margaret for 3 months, ever since that car accident took both her parents on the highway out of Asheville. Margaret had welcomed her in without hesitation, or rather with the hesitation carefully hidden beneath decades of practiced hospitality. Olivia was her late cousin's daughter, or at least that's what everyone believed. "Would you like me to make tea?" Olivia's voice called from the hallway, soft, practiced, as if she was used to walking on the eggshells of other people's emotions. "No, thank you, dear," Margaret answered, still staring at the canvas, eyes, glassy mouth tight. She heard the cupboard door open anyway, the quiet clatter of porcelain. Olivia never really asked. She just did. Margaret walked down the hallway, passing oil portraits of strangers she once knew intimately, faces now blurred by time and disinterest. She stopped by one in particular, a self-portrait painted nearly 30 years ago. She looked stronger in it, defiant even. Now she wasn't sure if that woman was still in her somewhere. At the kitchen table, Olivia had set out 2 cups, the tea kettle quietly steaming beside her. She smiled, and the corners of her mouth didn't quite lift. Margaret sat slowly. "I had a call from the doctor this morning." Olivia's eyes flicked up. "Everything okay?" Margaret took a deep breath, steadying her voice like one steadies a brush hovering above canvas. "He said the memory lapses are more concerning than we thought. I might need to begin preparations. They've recommended I consider moving into a facility." The room stilled. Even the steam from the kettle seemed to halt in midair. "I see," Olivia said quietly. She lifted the kettle, poured the water, and stirred sugar into her own cup, never asking Margaret how she took hers. "Do you feel like that's necessary?" "That's the difficult part," Margaret said. "I don't feel anything. Just blank spaces. Mornings I don't remember. Doors left open. Things misplaced." Olivia nodded, her eyes lowering to the tea. "That must be hard." Margaret watched her. "I'll need to start organizing my affairs, possibly meet with my lawyer to update the will. I think it's time." Olivia looked up then, and her face didn't betray surprise. "Do you want help?" Margaret smiled, a tight thing that never reached her eyes. "Not yet, but thank you." Silence hung between them, broken only by the ticking grandfather clock in the next room. Margaret stirred her tea, though she had no intention of drinking it. Her mind was already in the upstairs study, planning the placement of the small recording device she'd ordered 2 days ago under the name Anne March. It had arrived that morning, sealed discreetly in a brown envelope with no return address. Later that evening, after Olivia had gone to bed, Margaret padded barefoot through the house. It creaked under her weight like an old ship at sea. She opened the false panel behind the bookshelf in the study, an old hiding place from a time when secrets had to be physical, not just emotional. She opened the envelope. a pen-shaped camera nearly invisible to the naked eye. Motion activated. It would capture sound and video. She tested it once, pointing it at the window and speaking in a low voice. "My name is Margaret Hale. I do not have memory loss. I am placing this device here for one reason: I no longer know who I can trust." She turned it off, reviewed the footage. Crisp, clear. The shadows on her face made her look older, wearier. She leaned back in the creaking chair and stared at the shelves of books that hadn't been read in years. In the hallway, she installed a second device behind the wall, sconce angled toward the living room where Olivia often took phone calls. The third she placed beneath the antique side table near the foyer, where she kept her gallery ledger. It had been moved recently. She hadn't said anything, but she noticed. Margaret always noticed. That's the curse of artists: they see everything and say nothing until the canvas demands it. By the time she crawled into bed at 2:30 a.m., Margaret had reviewed the feed from all 3 cameras. Nothing yet. Olivia appeared in the footage twice, walking silently, holding a book, refilling a glass of water. Nothing concrete, but Margaret wasn't looking for proof of action yet. She was looking for absence of reaction. She was looking for what Olivia didn't say. The next morning, the light cut through the blinds in shards, slicing across the floor like accusations. Margaret rose slowly, every movement deliberate, every joint stiff with the kind of tension that doesn't come from age, but from anticipation. She entered the kitchen. Olivia was already there, humming a tune that Margaret couldn't place. She stood barefoot on the tile, her back to Margaret, stirring something in a pot. Margaret reached for the sugar bowl and noticed it was misplaced on the left side of the counter, not the right. A minor thing. But Margaret's hands were memory in themselves. They didn't forget. Someone had rearranged her kitchen. She said nothing. Instead, she lifted her teacup and looked across the table at Olivia, who smiled again. "Did you sleep okay?" Olivia asked, voice syrupy. "I did," Margaret lied. They sat there facing each other like old chess opponents who know the real game is not played on the board, but in the eyes. Olivia crossed her legs, her knee tapping gently. Margaret sipped her tea, then let her eyes wander to the framed painting behind Olivia's head, an early work. Expressionist, harsh red tones. She'd painted it the night her father died. Olivia had once called it unsettling. Olivia reached into her tote bag, pulled out a small notepad, and flipped through. "Do you want me to help start organizing paperwork today? Medical stuff. Maybe we should look into places around Mount Pleasant." Margaret didn't blink. "I thought I said not yet." Olivia smiled. "You did. Just thinking ahead." Margaret leaned forward. "How far ahead?" The moment passed. Olivia set the notepad down. "I just want to help." "Of course you do," Margaret thought. "You just don't know what you're helping yourself to yet." Later, in the solitude of her bedroom, Margaret rewatched the footage from the last 24 hours. She studied the frame-by-frame video of Olivia in the living room, flipping through what appeared to be a journal. Margaret zoomed in. It was one of her sketchbooks. Not particularly valuable unless you knew what to look for. A sketch of a girl. The same eyes that haunted the unfinished portrait in the studio. Margaret paused the video. The camera caught a flicker of recognition in Olivia's eyes as she looked at the drawing. Not admiration, not appreciation, recognition. And then something else. Resentment. Margaret leaned back in her chair. The first seed of certainty bloomed in her chest. Not fear, not anger, but something colder, something resolute. She clicked the video off and opened a drawer in her nightstand. Inside, a letter sealed in yellowed wax. It had remained unopened for 26 years. The return address, Asheville. A name handwritten in blue ink, Eleanor Lark. She didn't open it. Not yet. She slid the letter back into the drawer and closed it softly. If the betrayal was coming, it wouldn't come as a surprise. It would come as confirmation. The house was silent, cloaked in the velvet of 2 a.m., when the lies began to slip through the cracks like rising smoke. Margaret sat awake in the upstairs study, wrapped in a faded robe. The glow from the small surveillance monitor casting ghostly shadows on her face. Her hands rested still on her lap, but her eyes were alive, sharp scanning, absorbing. The screen was split into 3 camera feeds: the living room, the hallway by the guest bedroom, and the entrance to the studio. In the lower left quadrant, movement flickered. Olivia, barefoot. Careful, she padded across the living room in leggings and a sweatshirt. In her hand, a cell phone screen dimmed. She paused, glanced toward the hallway as if sensing she were being watched. Margaret didn't blink. The girl's voice was low, but the camera's microphone hidden beneath the antique side table picked it up clearly. She doesn't remember anything. Honestly, it's kind of scary. But convenient, Olivia said. A pause, then a soft chuckle. No, I haven't asked her to sign yet. I want to do it right, a little at a time. Margaret leaned closer, her jaw tightened. Listen! Olivia continued, pacing slowly now. Once we have a few pieces with her name on them, we can get them appraised. I looked up some of her older stuff it's selling again, quietly. But there's interest, especially that pre-95 series. I need her to trust me. A male voice crackled faintly in response, too low to make out. Olivia nodded, unaware of the eye watching her from upstairs. Yeah, just keep me posted. I'm thinking the self-portraits first. She doesn't even go into the back studio anymore. Should be easy. Margaret reached forward, pressed pause on the footage. The image froze with Olivia mid-step, mouth half-open, eyes glancing down like a thief caught in the act of unlocking a safe. Trust me, Olivia had said. But Margaret knew that tone. She'd painted that expression before on patrons, on lovers, on herself. It was the face people wore when they needed something they hadn't earned. She rewound the footage, played it again slowly. This time she caught it, the faint smile curling at the corner of Olivia's mouth, not amusement, anticipation. At 7:03 a.m. the house was still asleep, but Margaret was wide awake. She went downstairs in silence. The air was thick, weighted, the kind of stillness that hangs in cathedrals or courtrooms, places where judgment waits to be passed. In the kitchen, everything was too clean. The tea towels had been folded into perfect rectangles. The ceramic canisters were rearranged sugar flour coffee in a different order than yesterday. Olivia had been here. Margaret opened the drawer beside the fridge where she kept her sketch pads. 3 were missing. She didn't need to look far. On the breakfast table, beneath the gloss of a magazine, lay one of her journals, spine-cracked pages rifled. It was the green leather one, the one with notations on color theories and spatial philosophy. Nothing particularly confidential, but still, it hadn't been left out, not by her. Margaret sat down slowly, eyes drifting toward the wide picture window that overlooked the garden. Sunlight had started to filter in, catching the corners of dust motes as they swirled through the air like suspended secrets. She opened the journal and flipped through. One page was dog-eared. She turned to it. A rough sketch, a familiar one. The portrait of the girl, unfinished, no signature. Her hand hovered over the paper fingertips, grazing the edges. It wasn't the drawing itself that made her breath hitch. It was the tiny indentation beside the chin. A pen had pressed into the paper, someone trying to trace or replicate the lines. Margaret closed the book. The next evening she pretended to sleep. She'd taken to napping on the couch in the parlor, claiming the upstairs stairs made her knees ache at night. Olivia had offered to help. Of course she had. But Margaret insisted on her independence, feigning confusion about her medications, and repeating herself at dinner to maintain the illusion. By 11:30 she heard Olivia's door creak open. She lay motionless as the soft steps passed through the hallway and into the studio. The moment the door clicked shut, Margaret rose without a sound and slipped upstairs to the study. She watched. The camera in the studio activated with a soft green light. Olivia appeared in frame, a flashlight in hand. She didn't turn on the overhead lights smart, but not smart enough. She moved like someone who'd been here before. She bypassed the landscape canvases, the old florals, and headed straight for the rear shelves where the portraits were stored, specifically the ones from Margaret's early career. Olivia removed 2, held them up to the light. Then she pulled out her phone and snapped pictures. Margaret watched her own artwork being documented like artifacts at a crime scene. Then came the moment that stopped Margaret cold. Olivia found a small square canvas tucked between 2 large frames. It was unmarked. The edges were raw. Margaret had never shown it publicly, never even titled it. It was the one she had drawn right after the birth, before the adoption, before the silence. A baby girl. Eyes open, mouth agape, skin dappled with the purple tints of early life. Olivia stared at it for a long time. Then slowly she reached into her bag and pulled out a black fountain pen. She didn't sign the canvas. She hovered above it. Her hand trembled, then withdrew. She replaced the painting exactly where she found it and backed away. Margaret exhaled. So she wasn't ready to forge, not yet. But the intent was there. The next morning at breakfast, Olivia was cheerful. Too cheerful. She brought scones from the French bakery downtown. Warm, soft, still smelling of almond and butter. Margaret bit into one and smiled. "You're in a good mood," she said. "I slept well, and the bakery had no line for once." Margaret sipped her tea. "Did you visit the studio last night?" Olivia blinked. "No." "Why?" Margaret smiled politely. "Just thought I heard something. Maybe the wind." Olivia folded her napkin with precise fingers. "The back windows creak sometimes." Margaret said. "I'll have them checked." That afternoon, Margaret opened her computer and began a search of her own. She typed Margaret Hale Art Appraisal, then Margaret Hale Charleston Collector Interest, then Forgery Detection Artist Signature. She already knew what she would find. What she didn't expect was the discussion board thread on a collector site. Username E. Chambers had posted a query about authenticating unsigned Hale pieces. Beneath it, a comment from Olark6. "I may have access to some early portraits. Will confirm authenticity. Looking for trusted buyers only." Margaret stared at the screen. Lark. Her stomach twisted. It couldn't be a coincidence. She hadn't used that name in over 2 decades. But someone had. Someone who knew. Someone who wanted to be seen. She clicked the profile. The location was blank. No other posts. Just that single message. She sat in the quiet for a long time. Later that night, she checked the footage again. Olivia was in her room, curled up with a sketchbook, one of Margaret's, and was attempting to replicate her style. Her technique was decent, fluid, intentional, but the weight wasn't there. The pressure in the lines, the history behind each angle, it was missing. She was imitating, not becoming. And yet there was something else. A frustration in her movements, a desperation in how tightly she gripped the pencil, how she slashed through her own attempts. Margaret paused the video at a frame where Olivia had just thrown the sketch pad aside and buried her face in her hands. That wasn't greed. That was grief, or guilt, or both. The next morning, Margaret left a note on the breakfast table. "Studio door is open. Thought you might like to look again. M." No mention of cameras, no hint of confrontation. She just waited and watched. As Olivia entered the studio that afternoon, a soft gasp escaped her lips. The portrait of the girl, unfinished, eyes still blank, was on the easel. Beneath it, a paintbrush, and beside the brush, a note. "Some stories are too heavy to carry alone. If you want to tell me something, now's the time." Margaret watched from the study. Olivia stood there for what felt like forever, and then slowly she reached out and touched the canvas. Not the frame, not the edge, but the heart of the painting, the place where the signature would go. And she whispered something Margaret couldn't hear, but her lips moved like a prayer. The old woman leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed. The betrayal she had expected was beginning to mutate. This wasn't about money, not entirely. This was about identity, an identity Margaret knew was far more dangerous. The sky above Charleston had turned the color of old bruises, purple smudges bleeding into pale yellow dusk, descending with an almost conspiratorial hush. Olivia walked quickly along Church Street, her jacket pulled tight despite the warm evening. She checked over her shoulder once, then again, before slipping into the side alley near the iron-gated entrance of Gallery Chambers. The door opened before she could knock. Ethan. He was tall, 40-something, too thin, with a face that looked like it had been sketched in sharp, hurried lines. His jacket was rumpled, but his shoes were polished to a shine that gleamed like a lie. "You're late," he said. Olivia didn't smile. "Traffic." He stepped aside, letting her in. The gallery was dark except for one overhead light, casting a focused beam on a single painting, something abstract and violent, all reds and blacks. Olivia glanced at it, uninterested. She had other things on her mind. Ethan poured bourbon into 2 cut-glass tumblers. "Want one?" She shook her head. "Let's just talk." Ethan leaned against the edge of a display case. How's the old woman still wandering around in a fog? Olivia bristled. Don't talk about her like that. He grinned. Oh, I see. You're the devoted granddaughter now? I didn't come here for that. No, he said, taking a sip. You came here to talk business. And I'm still listening. Olivia pulled a file folder from her tote and handed it to him. Inside were high-res photographs of 5 original Margaret Hale paintings, 3 landscapes, 1 still life, and a portrait of a woman in profile, all unsigned. She won't sign anything, Olivia said. She's slipping. Sometimes she doesn't even recognize her own work. Ethan flipped through the photos, whistling low. Pre-95 era, brushworks clean. Still has that raw angst collector's love. Damn, these are legit. He paused at the final image. What's this, he asked. A portrait she started. Never finished, never signed. Ethan stared at it for a long time. This one's different. Olivia said nothing. He looked up. 1 signature, just 1 on any of these, and I can move it within the week. Maybe 50 grand. Maybe more. You sure you can't get her to sign one? She hasn't picked up a pen in weeks. Ethan raised an eyebrow. But she trusts you, right? Olivia's jaw clenched. I'll see what I can do. Ethan stepped closer, voice dropping. You get me that signature, Olivia, and we both get what we want. Money. Clean deal. No one gets hurt. But someone already had. Back at the house, Margaret was in the study. The gallery book lay open on her desk, but she wasn't reading it. She was listening, watching. She had reviewed the footage of Olivia's midnight studio visit a dozen times. The hesitation before touching the portrait. The way she'd stared at the unfinished girl like she recognized her. Margaret knew that gaze. It was the same look she herself had worn the day she surrendered her daughter at the hospital 26 years ago. A look not of longing but of unfinished business. She rose and walked to the far wall of the study, unlocked the bottom drawer of the antique bureau, and pulled out a small iron key. It fit the lock of the floor safe, hidden beneath the faded rug. A mechanical click echoed in the quiet room. Inside the safe, wrapped in aged linen, lay a single canvas. Margaret lifted it gently, unrolling it on the table with trembling fingers. The face stared back at her. A girl of no more than 10 captured in oil and shadow. Brown hair, wide-set eyes, the faintest dimple near her lip like she was about to smile but had changed her mind. Margaret stared at the painting. Her breath caught. There was something about the curve of the jaw, the tilt of the chin. It whispered of blood, of shared memory, of something she had tried to forget but could never quite bury. She had never named the piece, never even catalogued it. It had lived its entire life in the dark, and it was unsigned, not because she forgot, but because it had never felt finished, not until now. She wrapped the canvas again gently, reverently, and placed it back in the safe. As she turned the key and locked it once more, she whispered to the empty room, I know who you are. Later that night, the house groaned under the wind. The shutters rattled. Rain had begun to fall, soft at first, then harder, beating against the windows like fingers demanding entry. Margaret was asleep when the noise woke her. It was sharp, splitting, like fabric tearing. No, not fabric. Canvas. She sat up, heart hammering. The sound came again, fainter this time, but unmistakable. She reached for her cane, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and crept down the hallway. The house was dark, save for the faint glow from the nightlight in the hallway. Her fingers brushed the wall for balance as she descended the stairs. The studio door was ajar. She pushed it open, breath caught in her throat. The room was still. Paints lay undisturbed on the shelves. The turpentine sat capped on the table. Everything looked normal, until she saw the easel. The portrait the girl had been removed from its place in the safe and placed upright on display, and there, slashed cleanly across the face, was a single diagonal cut, from temple to chin. The gash wasn't messy, it was deliberate, surgical, a quiet violence. Margaret stumbled forward, her cane thudding against the wood floor. She reached out and touched the edge of the tear. The canvas gave under her finger like a wound. Whoever had done this hadn't tried to steal it. They hadn't even tried to hide it. They had wanted her to see. She turned slowly, scanning the room. There were no signs of forced entry. No mud on the floor, no shattered glass. Nothing was missing except the illusion of safety. Margaret locked the studio door behind her, then turned the deadbolt twice. She drew the curtains, closed the windows. Then she sat in the corner chair facing the painting and waited. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply stared at the ruined face as if daring it to reveal more. The tear ran across the cheekbone, the same place a birthmark once lived on a girl she had seen only once, swaddled in hospital linen, eyes already searching for someone who would never hold her. She had thought time would bury that face, but now, decades later, someone had resurrected it only to tear it down. Who would do this? And why not steal it? Unless, Margaret's heart skipped, unless it wasn't an act of theft, unless it was a message, a question, a confrontation. She pressed her lips into a thin line. Her mind, still sharp, worked quickly. The cameras. She rushed well as much as she could to the study and pulled up the footage from the past 3 hours. The front door hadn't opened, no activity. The side entrance also quiet. But then movement in the hallway outside the guest room. 14 a.m. Olivia, wrapped in her robe, barefoot, eyes focused. She walked directly past the living room and toward the studio. She hesitated, looked over her shoulder, then entered. She remained inside for 13 minutes. When she emerged, her hands were empty. But her face. Margaret zoomed in. There was no guilt, no fear, only grief, raw, twisted grief, as if she had just laid something to rest or uncovered something she didn't want to see. Margaret sat back in the chair, watching the paused frame of Olivia walking silently down the hallway. The pieces clicked. The way Olivia stared at the portrait weeks ago. The way she touched the edge of the sketchbook, the trembling hesitation in the studio, the forged username Olark26, the familiar mouth, the dimple. The torn canvas wasn't a threat. It was a cry, a question without words. A daughter standing in front of a mother and screaming without sound. "Why didn't you keep me?" Margaret leaned forward, her voice cracking the stillness. "Who are you really, Olivia?" But she already knew. And now that the portrait had bled, it was time for the truth to follow. Rain tapped against the studio windows like a metronome, slow and relentless. The smell of turpentine still lingered from the night before, but it was the silence that pressed most heavily against the walls, thick, unmoving, sacred. Margaret stood in front of the slashed portrait, her hand hovering inches from the torn canvas. The cut had dried, the raw fibers of linen frayed outward like open nerve endings. It wasn't just vandalism, it was a cry. And it had reached her. She turned off the main lights and allowed only the soft amber glow of a single desk lamp to remain bathing the room in shadows. Slowly she wheeled out the other easel hidden behind the tall shelf where she'd stored canvases too personal to hang, too haunted to discard. She took out the old box, worn leather, brass clasps. Inside, a tape recorder, a photograph of a faceless man in a dark suit and 3 folded letters that had never been mailed. Letters that began with "My darling Eleanor." But there was one more thing, a hospital bracelet, plastic discolored with time, handwritten in fading black ink, "Baby Girl Hale, 04/22/1997. Margaret sat down slowly, deliberately. The chair creaked beneath her, and for a long while she said nothing. Just listened to the rain, to her breath, to the deep space between past and present. Then quietly she began to speak, not to herself, not to the room, but to the canvas. "She would have had your eyes," Margaret said, barely louder than the storm. "Your cruelty, perhaps, your charm. But God help me, I loved you anyway. I loved you enough to believe you when you said you'd leave her, that you'd start over, that we'd paint together in Paris." Her voice cracked brittle as autumn leaves. "Do you remember what you said when I told you I was pregnant? You said I should treat it like a sketch, something to erase, a mistake." Margaret reached for the tape recorder, pressed play. Nothing. Then static. Then a voice, her own, younger, more naive, speaking into the mic. "Margaret Hale, April 3rd, 1997, 12 days before due date. Today I walked past the gallery on King Street and saw his painting in the window, still signed with her last name." She fast-forwarded. "April 22nd, 1997. It's a girl. 7 pounds, 9 ounces. They let me hold her for 23 minutes before they took her. I named her Eleanor. I didn't tell them the father's name. I didn't tell anyone. I painted her that night. I tried to get the curve of her nose right, but I couldn't. She kept moving in my mind. I could hear her crying even after she was gone." Click! The recorder stopped. Margaret sat back. Her fingers ran through her silver-streaked hair. The storm had deepened now, as if the sky was mourning with her. She remembered every second. The cold white sheets of the hospital bed. The way the nurses smiled at her carefully, like they didn't want to say what they were thinking. Another one of you artists knocked up by a married man. But they didn't know. They didn't know that Margaret had begged him to stay, begged him to take responsibility. He hadn't come to the hospital, hadn't called, hadn't answered her letters. Instead, what came was pressure. From his wife, from his family, from the gallery that carried both their names. Margaret had been one of the rising stars of the Southern art world. But fame, especially for women, was conditional. It required silence, clean backstories, and no scandals. So they made her choose. The gallery offered her a deal hand over the child quietly, and they'd continue selling her work. Make it disappear, and they'd make her a legend. She did it. She handed her baby girl to a foster rep named Mrs. Keating on a rainy Tuesday morning in a courthouse waiting room that smelled of mildew and paper. No one spoke. No one hugged her. She walked home alone and painted until her fingers bled. The portrait Eleanor remained incomplete. She never found out where they took her, never looked, never dared. What right did she have? And yet, Margaret rose from the chair and opened the top drawer of her desk. Inside was the photograph Olivia had given her when she'd first moved in, of her parents smiling. But Margaret had always known something was off. The angle was strange. The woman in the photo had dark hair, brown eyes, but Olivia's were green, and the man his jawline. It was the same as... She dug deeper into the drawer until she found it an old newspaper clipping. Painter, accused of affair, steps down from Charleston gallery board. The photo was black and white, grainy, but the face was unmistakable. Sebastian Calder, a man who'd once called her my muse between the bed sheets of a rented loft in Savannah. Sebastian had died in a car crash in 2004. She had never gone to the funeral, but she remembered every line of his face. And now when she looked at Olivia, God, how had she not seen it sooner? The cheekbones, the eyes, that faint cleft in her chin. It wasn't just Margaret's blood that ran through Olivia. It was his too. She walked back into the studio and turned on the camera. Not the hidden one. The old one, the VHS camcorder she used to record technique videos in the 90s. She pressed record and sat in front of the ruined painting. Olivia, she said, her voice steady but fragile. If you ever find this, if you ever need to hear the truth from me and no one else. She looked at the torn canvas. You are my daughter. Tears began to fall slow and soundless. I didn't give you away because I didn't love you. I gave you away because the world wouldn't have loved you with me. I gave you away because I was too cowardly to fight for you. I thought I was protecting you, but I was only protecting myself. Outside, thunder cracked like a gavel. Margaret walked to the safe, opened it, and brought out the second unfinished portrait, one she had never shown anyone. It was a mirror to the first. Another girl, a little older, same eyes, same jaw. This one she had started in 2005 after reading the obituary. Sebastian Calder had died survived by his wife and one child. There had been no name, no mention of Margaret. But something in her cracked open that day, a seed of a hope she thought had died. So she painted again. Tried to guess what her daughter would have looked like at 8, 10, 15. Now looking between the two canvases, the slashed one and the imagined one, Margaret felt a wave of certainty. The slashed painting wasn't a threat. It was a message, a daughter trying to say I know, a daughter demanding why. She moved slowly back to the easel, took the damaged portrait down and began sewing a clean line of linen into the tear, restitching it, not hiding the wound but honoring it. And as the needle passed through the canvas, she whispered, You came back, didn't you? The room felt smaller, closer, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Margaret paused. Her stitching looked out the window and saw Olivia in the yard, standing in the rain. No umbrella, no coat, just standing there, looking up at the window. At her, Margaret's breath caught. The girl didn't wave, didn't smile. She turned and walked back toward the house. The door opened, then footsteps down the hallway. Margaret waited and whispered, You're back, aren't you? Morning light crept into the dining room, slowly brushing over the old oak table like a careful hand. The air smelled faintly of brewed coffee and the citrus cleaner Olivia used too liberally. Margaret stood at the edge of the kitchen, a porcelain plate in one hand, a worn photograph in the other. She stared at the picture a long time before placing it deliberately beside the water glass at Olivia's usual seat. It was a photograph not meant to be found, not meant to be shared, but Margaret had kept it for years tucked behind a faded envelope in her private drawer. She had taken it herself on a borrowed disposable camera, no flashlight leaking in from a cracked window. The photo showed a young Margaret cradling a baby, both cloaked in hospital blankets. The woman's face was tense with exhaustion, but radiant, her mouth half open in awe. The baby was wrinkled, yawning, her face partially shadowed, but her tiny hand reached up, clinging to her mother's necklace. Olivia didn't know the photo existed, but Margaret wanted her to see it, wanted the silence between them to rupture. She stepped back, adjusted her silk scarf, and poured the last of the coffee into Olivia's mug. It steamed faintly in the chilled air. Outside, birds chirped nervously in the sycamore trees. Even they seemed to sense the shift. Footsteps. Olivia came into the room, towel drying her hair, still in a gray sweatshirt and loose pants. She looked up sleepy-eyed and managed a smile. "Smells good." Margaret didn't respond. She sat down slowly, the creak of her chair deliberate, heavy. Olivia poured herself a glass of water and reached for the slice of toast already buttered on her plate, but then her hand froze mid-air. She saw it. The photograph. It lay flat, not staged, not framed, just placed. Raw, unapologetic. Olivia's eyes widened. The movement in her fingers stuttered. She reached out, brushing the edge of the photo with her pinky. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged. She stared, and then the glass in her other hand slipped. It struck the edge of her plate, tipped, and crashed against the floor. Shards scattered beneath the table, water soaked into the worn rug. She stood frozen, hand hovering, lips parted. Margaret's eyes didn't leave her. "Do you see something familiar?" Margaret asked coldly. Her voice was low, controlled, too controlled. Olivia's gaze flickered between the photo and Margaret. Her voice trembled. Where did you get this?" Margaret didn't blink. "That's not important." Olivia swallowed, chest rising fast. "Who's the baby?" Margaret arched a brow, and something in her face, some painful recognition, flashed. "I was hoping you'd tell me," she replied. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded, like the air before a lightning strike. Both women sat still, as if afraid that any word might tip the world sideways. Then Olivia stepped back. I need to go clean this up," she muttered, kneeling to gather the shards. Margaret didn't move to help. As Olivia bent under the table, her face momentarily out of view, Margaret's expression softened, just briefly. A flicker of something maternal, some ache that hadn't died completely. But it vanished as quickly as it came. When Olivia rose, glass in hand, she didn't look at her. She walked toward the kitchen sink, dumped the shards into the trash, and left the photo on the table untouched. Later that evening, the house was quiet again. The storm had moved on. The sky, washed in lavender, gave the illusion of calm. But inside the walls still held onto the tension like a memory that refused to fade. Margaret sat by the fire in the parlor, knitting without purpose. Her fingers moved mechanically, stitch after stitch, while her mind wandered corridors decades long. She heard Olivia's door close upstairs, not slammed, but not careful either. Something had shifted, and Margaret knew. She'd seen it in Olivia's eyes. Recognition, not just of the photograph, but of something deeper. A fracture sealed for too long, a truth pressing up from under skin and bone. Meanwhile, upstairs, Olivia sat cross-legged on the edge of her bed. The photograph now tucked inside the journal Margaret had left in the study, a book she had discovered earlier that day, buried beneath boxes of faded exhibition flyers and private letters. She hadn't meant to snoop, at least not that time, but something about the book's worn leather spine had drawn her in. The initials M.H. were almost invisible, rubbed away by time. She opened it. At first it seemed like another artist's notebook. Color theory, light studies, sketches of flower petals, cityscapes, and hands. But then the entries began, written in ink, not pencil, dated intimate. May 4th, 1997. I dreamt of her again. The nurses told me not to get attached. But how can I forget the sound of her crying when they pulled her from my arms? Olivia flipped to the next page. May 6th. I painted her. I had to. She had my chin and his eyes. God help me. Page after page, a woman unraveling, a mother mourning someone still alive. And then came the last entry dated years later after Margaret's first major exhibition in Paris, March 12, 2004. Her name was changed. She's 15 now. I saw her in a school newspaper clipping online. Brown hair, serious eyes. They called her Olivia Calder. No mention of me. Of course not. Why would there be? Olivia closed the book as if it had burned her. She stared into the darkness of her room, the photo lying beside her now. The baby in the picture had her nose, her mouth, her hand wrapped around that necklace, the same one Margaret still wore. How many times had Olivia stared at it? Wondered where it came from. She picked up the photo again, her fingers shaking. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. It was too much. Too late. Too soon. The room felt smaller now, like the air had thickened around her, pressing against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. She stood and walked to the dresser, picked up the glass perfume bottle Margaret had given her weeks ago. She didn't know then why it felt so intimate. She did now. She clutched it tight. The memory of the slashed canvas returned. That girl's face, the pain in her own hand as she had torn it. She hadn't done it out of malice. She had done it because she needed to know. Because the painting had known her before she knew herself. Because when she stood before it, it felt like looking into a past she'd never been allowed to claim. Olivia collapsed onto the floor, the perfume bottle still clutched tight in her palm. She whispered not to herself but to the woman in the other room. "I know." The word didn't travel far. But Margaret in the parlor heard something, some shift in the architecture of silence. She looked toward the ceiling. Didn't move. Didn't speak. But in her lap her fingers dropped a stitch. The yarn unwound, and she didn't fix it. The afternoon light had dimmed, as if the house itself braced for what it could no longer hold back. Margaret sat at the small writing desk in the parlor, the leather-bound journal open before her, pen poised but unmoving. Her hands trembled, not from age, but from the weight of something she could no longer pretend not to see. She heard Olivia moving upstairs, heavy, unsteady footsteps, the sound of drawers opening and closing, then silence, then the door. Olivia stood at the threshold to the parlor. She looked hollow. Her eyes-rimmed red jaw clenched too tightly for someone so young. She was holding something behind her back. Margaret looked up. There was no smile, no warmth, just cold precision. She folded her hands. "Sit," she said. Olivia hesitated, then stepped into the room slowly, deliberately. She placed something on the desk, the photograph, the same one Margaret had placed by the breakfast plate that morning. "I found the journal," Olivia said. Her voice was low, hoarse. Margaret didn't look surprised, only tired. "Then I imagine you have questions." Olivia laughed, but it was a sound without joy. Questions number just one. She stepped closer, the firelight catching the shimmer of fresh tears. "Did you ever intend to tell me?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She stared at the photograph, the image of herself young, terrified, euphoric, holding the baby she would never see grow. "I tried," Margaret said finally. "More than once. But you were already so angry. I thought if I told you it would only make it worse." Olivia flinched. "Angry? You thought I was angry?" She took a sharp breath. Her hands were shaking now, and her voice rose with the storm gathering behind her ribs. "You gave me away. You left me in some stranger's arms and disappeared. And then when I finally found you, when I moved heaven and earth to get here, you played games. You watched me on hidden cameras like I was some kind of intruder. You were forging my signature." Margaret shot back, her voice suddenly sharp. "I was desperate," Olivia shouted. "Desperate to make you see me not as some caretaker or orphan you pitied, as your daughter." The word hung in the air, sudden and violent. Daughter. Neither had said it aloud before. Margaret's face crumpled slightly, but she held her ground. "You lied to me. You manipulated your way into my life." "I had to," Olivia cried. "You were never going to open that door otherwise. You spent your whole life locking it." Margaret stood too fast. Her knee cracked with the movement, but she didn't sit back down. She pointed a trembling finger toward the hearth. "You think I had a choice? You think I wanted to sign that paper, to walk out of that hospital with nothing in my arms but a scarf that still smelled like you?" "I was your child," Olivia screamed. "And you forgot me." "No," Margaret said, voice breaking. "I tried to forget the pain. That's not the same." There it was, the line neither of them could cross without consequence. Olivia shook her head slowly. "I needed a mother. I needed someone to tell me I mattered, and all I got was silence, and shadows, and questions no one could answer. She pulled the journal from her coat, flung it onto the rug between them, pages bent, warped from tears. And then I find this. You kept everything, every memory, every damn sketch of me, your ghost child. You painted me like some penance, some shame you buried in the basement. Margaret stepped forward, her voice raw. You were never shame, never. Then why didn't you come for me? Silence, only the sound of the fire crackling and the clock ticking like a judge's gavel. Why didn't you come for me? Olivia repeated, quieter now. I waited. I kept waiting. Margaret's lips parted. No words came. Her knees buckled slightly as she lowered herself to the arm of the chair. I didn't know if you'd want me, she whispered. I wanted answers, Olivia said, and you gave me doubt. They stood there breathing in the thick quiet that followed, as if the air had stopped moving in solidarity with their grief. Then Margaret's eyes dropped to the journal on the floor, and something caught her attention. A piece of paper dislodged by the fall lay half-tucked under the page. A birth certificate. She knelt down slowly, picked it up. Where did you get this? She asked, voice barely audible. Olivia didn't answer. Margaret unfolded it with trembling fingers. There it was, her name, and under Mother Margaret Hale, under Father redacted. No mention of adoption, no legal seal of surrender. She stared at it like it was a hallucination. Her hands shook harder. This can't be. I found it in a box, Olivia said. My father, the man who raised me, kept it hidden. I found it after he died. Margaret looked up at her, tears glistening. You always knew. Olivia's throat clenched. I suspected. But I didn't want it to be true. I wanted you to be someone else, someone better. And now Margaret whispered, I don't know, Olivia said. I came here thinking I'd expose you, make you pay. But then, you weren't the monster I imagined, just a lonely woman in a house full of ghosts. Margaret pressed the certificate to her chest like a letter from the dead. She reached out with her other hand slowly, cautiously. Olivia. But Olivia stepped back. Don't, not yet. Margaret's arm dropped. Her voice cracked. You're my daughter. You were supposed to be my mother. They stared at each other, the words burning a hole between them. Then Olivia turned, walked to the door, and stopped. I don't hate you, she said, not turning back. I want to, she added, voice almost gone. But I don't. She left the room. The echo of her footsteps on the wooden floor was the only sound left. Margaret sat back down, the certificate still clutched in her hand, and for the first time in years, she wept without painting, without distraction, only truth, and the fire burned on, alone. The sun had dipped low behind the oak trees, casting long shadows through the parlor windows. A warm haze wrapped the room, but inside Margaret everything had gone cold. She sat in the same chair, the birth certificate still folded tightly in her lap, as if letting go of it might mean losing Olivia all over again. Footsteps echoed on the staircase, measured, calm. Olivia entered the room without knocking. She was no longer crying. Something about that frightened Margaret more than anything. Olivia stood at the center of the room, arms folded across her chest, holding a weathered envelope. She didn't speak for a long time, just looked at Margaret the way a witness looks at a suspect about to confess. Finally, she broke the silence. It was the letter. Margaret blinked, confused. What letter? Olivia walked to the fireplace mantel and placed the envelope down gently like it was evidence. My father, my adoptive father, was in a car accident 4 months ago. He survived just long enough for the ambulance. The next morning I went through his study. I was looking for insurance papers. Instead, I found this. She tapped the envelope once. It was from you, dated 1999, 2 years after I was born. Margaret's throat tightened. No one was supposed to keep that. Olivia's voice turned sharp. Well, he did. He kept it locked in a drawer with 2 photographs and a note that said, "Tell her if anything happens to me." But he never did. He never told me. She opened the envelope, pulled out the folded letter inside. Margaret didn't need to read it. She remembered every word. She had written it on a rainy night when guilt had clawed too deep into her chest to ignore. I'm sorry, Margaret whispered. I thought he'd burn it. I wish he had, Olivia snapped. I wish I had never read it. Do you know what it's like to realize your whole life was built on a lie? That every birthday card from some distant relative was just you hiding behind a curtain you never intended to open. Margaret's hands trembled. I wanted to open it so many times. But I was afraid. I didn't want to poison your life with my shame. Your shame, Olivia spat. This isn't about you being ashamed. It's about you walking away. You painted 1,000 daughters, but never once reached for the real one. Margaret stood too fast, her voice cracking. You don't know what it was like, what they threatened me with. I would have lost everything. They told me I was unfit, that I'd never work again if I kept you. I didn't need your career, Olivia hissed. I needed a mother. Margaret's knees gave slightly, and she gripped the edge of the chair for balance. Her voice dropped. You came here to punish me. Olivia nodded slowly, deliberately. Yes. She stepped forward, her eyes hard. I wanted to see if you'd recognize me, if you'd feel it. But you didn't. You let me serve your tea, fold your laundry, organize your files like I was just some stray dog you felt guilty for. That's not true, Margaret gasped. Olivia didn't blink. I forged your signature, yes. I met with Ethan, yes. But I wasn't trying to steal from you. I wanted to break the illusion, to force you to see what you left behind. Margaret collapsed into the chair. She buried her face in her hands. Tears came fast now, without shame. You don't understand. I've spent every night wondering where you were, wondering if you hated me. I painted you again and again because it was the only way I could keep you alive. I didn't think I deserved the real you. A pause. Then Olivia's voice, quieter now, more serrated than sharp. I didn't know what I was walking into when I came here. I had this fantasy that I'd confront you and feel free. But I don't. She looked away. I feel worse. Margaret looked up, face blotched with grief. Please don't go, not now, not after this. I didn't come here to stay, Olivia said. Margaret reached out a trembling hand. Olivia, listen to me. Mi đã mất con một lần rồi. Đừng bắt mẹ mất thêm lần nữa. The Vietnamese slipped from her lips without warning. It had been years since she'd spoken it, since she'd let the sound of it return. But it was the only way her heart could speak now. Olivia froze. Her breath hitched. Margaret hadn't meant to say it. The words had broken out of her raw, desperate. She stood across the space between them. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I was cowardly, selfish, everything you hate. But you're here. You're here, and that has to mean something. Olivia stepped back, breath uneven. I don't know what it means. Then let me find out with you, Margaret said. Let me try. But Olivia's expression changed. Steeled. I can't, she said. Her voice was small, not angry, just exhausted. I thought I could. I wanted to. But this house, it's full of things you never gave me. And I'm not strong enough to stay surrounded by what I lost. She turned to the door. Margaret followed her. Wait, just stay the night, please. But Olivia opened the door without turning back. I'll send someone for my things. Olivia. Margaret's voice cracked like a porcelain bowl dropped one too many times. But Olivia walked into the twilight, her silhouette fading in the orange-purple horizon. She didn't look back. Margaret stood at the doorway for a long time, watching the street, waiting for a figure to reappear. It didn't. She whispered into the still air, Forgive me. But only the wind answered, and the house, old and hollow, swallowed the silence whole. The rain had returned to Charleston, this time heavier, more urgent, as if the sky itself couldn't bear to keep quiet anymore. Olivia stood outside the old brick gallery on King Street Hood, up arms tight across her chest, phone clenched in her hand. A message glowed on the screen. Ethan Whitmore. I'm giving you 12 hours. Either sell the paintings or I leak the photos. No one will believe you weren't trying to scam her. Attached were 3 grainy but damning images. One of Olivia entering Ethan's private office. One of him handing her a pen. One most damaging of her holding a print of Margaret Hale's signature. They looked transactional, scheming. She felt the heat crawl up her neck as she stared at them. A week ago she wouldn't have cared. A week ago her heart had been set on revenge. Now everything had changed. The truth had cracked open a wound she hadn't known was still bleeding. And Margaret's voice, broken, pleading, still rang in her ears. Mẹ đã mất con một lần rồi. Đừng bắt mẹ mất thêm lần nữa. She turned off the phone, looked up at the city around her. Charleston had always looked beautiful from the outside, gas lamps, cobblestone alleys, Spanish moss dripping like silk from the oaks. But beauty here had sharp edges, whispers behind fans, sins hidden behind oil paintings. She made her decision. She walked back to her tiny rented room above the bakery, opened her laptop, and stared at the blinking cursor for several minutes. Then she hit go live. No makeup, no script, Just truth. The stream opened with her face filling the frame. Rain matted her hair to her forehead. "I don't know how many of you will see this," she said quietly, "but I need to tell the truth." She took a breath. "My name is Olivia Hale, and I'm the biological daughter of Margaret Hale, the artist." Pause. The comment bar began to flicker. Viewers were joining, some confused, some stunned. "I was given up at birth, adopted. I only found out recently after my adoptive father passed away and I discovered a letter from her." She glanced down briefly as if to make sure she still had the strength. "I came to Charleston under false pretenses. I pretended to be a distant relative, her goddaughter, so I could get close to her. I wanted to confront her. I wanted answers." More comments now, some skeptical, others shocked. She had no idea who I was. "I watched her. I judged her. I even considered selling her work without her knowing. I met with a man named Ethan Whitmore. He offered me money if I could forge her signature." She looked directly into the camera, voice shaking now. "I didn't do it, but I thought about it because I was angry. I felt abandoned, erased. A single tear broke loose, slid down her cheek. But then I saw her. The real her. Not the woman in the galleries or the gossip columns, just Margaret. Broken, brilliant, terrified of the past." The screen began to flood with hearts, angry emojis, questions. "I didn't come here to steal from her. I came here to ask why she left me, and I got my answer." She closed her eyes for a moment. She thought she was protecting me. She wasn't, but she wasn't trying to destroy me either. Then her tone shifted, stronger now. "And one more thing, Ethan Whitmore, if you're watching this, release the photos if you want. I don't care. I'm not hiding anymore." She reached for the mouse, hovered. "I don't know if I'll ever speak to Margaret again, but I'm not here to ruin her. I just wanted you to know the truth." Then click. The live stream ended. For a few seconds everything was still. Then her phone vibrated. Once, twice, then a dozen times. Texts, missed calls, emails, journalists, old classmates, strangers. Her name was trending in the Charleston area within an hour. Back at Margaret's house, the landline rang nonstop. Outside, a news van idled at the curb. Someone had left lilies on the doorstep with a note. "You are still their mother." Margaret didn't answer the door, didn't go online, didn't speak to the reporters. She simply turned off every light in the house except the one above her easel, and she began painting. Not a landscape, not a gallery piece, a portrait of a girl. Not as she had been at birth, not imagined at 10, but as she was now wounded, defiant, radiant with grief and fire. She painted until her hands cramped, until her body begged for rest. But she didn't stop, because this time she wasn't painting from memory. She was painting from truth. Outside, Charleston debated. The radio hosts speculated. Some called Olivia a manipulator. Others called her brave. Some blamed Margaret. Others revered her even more for being human. But in the center of it all, inside the quiet house with the shuttered windows, neither woman spoke. And Olivia disappeared. No one saw her at the bakery again. Her room above it was left clean, keys placed neatly on the desk. Her phone deactivated. Her social accounts gone. She was a name now, a confession in the algorithm. But Margaret kept painting, because she knew somehow Olivia wasn't gone. Not forever. Not this time. The morning was quiet. Not just the kind of quiet that settled in old Charleston homes with their heavy curtains and thick rugs, but the kind that felt sacred, as if the whole street had paused to let something long-awaited arrive. Margaret sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a navy shawl, fingers curled around a porcelain teacup that had long gone cold. Outside the window, the magnolia tree stirred gently in the breeze. It had bloomed early that year, clusters of white blossoms clinging to dark branches, like hope refusing to die. She hadn't painted in 3 days. Not because she didn't want to, because she didn't know what came next. And then the doorbell rang, not loud, just once, as if someone didn't want to wake the house, only the heart within it. Margaret stood slowly. Her legs had stiffened from stillness, but there was urgency in her chest. She walked through the hall, her slippers brushing against the floorboards, hand tightening on the doorknob. When she opened it, there was no one standing there, just a package, wrapped in craft paper. She bent down carefully, lifted it, familiar weight, familiar smell, oil paint and aged canvas. Her fingers trembled as she unwrapped it on the hallway floor. And there it was, the portrait, the one she had painted over 2 decades ago, unfinished. Of the baby she gave away, the canvas that Olivia had slashed in a moment of rage or revelation, now mended, a delicate patch of raw canvas stitched behind the tear, the seam barely visible. Not professionally restored, no gallery tricks, just thread, steady hands, patience, and on the bottom right corner beside Margaret's old signature was another, Olivia Hale, small, precise, almost shy. Margaret pressed her hand against her mouth. A sob broke through her throat before she could contain it. She stood clutching the canvas to her chest and opened the door again. This time Olivia was standing at the end of the porch steps. She wore the same gray coat from the night she left her hair pulled into a loose braid, a messenger bag slung over one shoulder. There were no cameras, no press, no audience. Just her. Margaret stepped out slowly barefoot, the porch wood warm beneath her feet. They didn't speak. Olivia didn't move. For a second, less than a breath, it looked like she might turn away again. But she didn't. Margaret crossed the distance canvas, still in hand, and stopped just before her. Her face crumpled. And then she dropped the painting onto the grass and reached for her, arms wide, desperate. Olivia fell into the embrace like someone who had been holding their breath for too long. No apology was spoken, no explanations offered. Just the collapse of 2 storms into one still moment. Margaret sobbed silently into her daughter's shoulder. Olivia's hands trembled against her back. When they finally pulled apart, both women's faces were streaked with tears, but neither wiped them away. They walked back inside together. Margaret placed the canvas on the easel in the studio, right where it had once stood decades ago. Sunlight streamed in now, softer than usual, like it too had been waiting. Margaret looked at the painting, then at Olivia. "I never thought I'd finish it," she whispered. Olivia shrugged off her bag and rolled up her sleeves. "Then maybe we should finish it together." Margaret blinked. "You still paint?" Olivia gave her a look. "You really think I could be your daughter and not?" Margaret laughed through the tears. "I don't even know what kind of color you use." "Mostly anger, but I'm learning to mix it with mercy." They stood side by side at the easel, brushes in hand. Silence between them, but this time not the dangerous kind. Margaret dipped her brush first, then paused. "I've painted 1,000 faces," she said, "but this is the only one that ever mattered." Olivia nodded, and together they began to blend flesh and shadow. Restore lines, soften the eyes, add the light that had been missing all these years. Hours passed. The sun moved across the floor. Neither noticed. Until Margaret finally stepped back, wiped her brush on an old rag and said, "There's something missing." Olivia tilted her head. Margaret handed her the brush. "You sign it." Olivia hesitated. "Are you sure?" Margaret nodded. Olivia leaned in steady hands and placed her name just below her mother's. Same corner, side by side. Margaret Hale and Olivia Hale. When she turned, Margaret was already looking at her, voice trembling. "Can you ever forgive me?" Olivia didn't answer right away. She looked at the canvas again, at what they'd made together, then back at Margaret. "I'm still here," she said simply. "Aren't I?" And that was enough. The morning Charleston air was thick with honeysuckle and promise. For the first time in years, the wooden sign outside 118 Sycamore Lane had been dusted off, polished, and hung back on its hinges. The carved letters, faded but dignified, read, "The Hale House, Art Lives Here." A quiet crowd had gathered at the front gate. Neighbors, strangers, a few reporters who were wise enough to keep their distance. But this was no gallery opening, no celebrity reappearance. It was something quieter, something holier. Inside, Margaret Hale stood in the doorway of her old studio, wearing the same navy shawl she'd had on the day Olivia returned. Her hands no longer trembled. Her cane rested by the sideboard untouched. She looked older, yes, but she looked alive. Olivia was kneeling in the center of the studio, helping 2 children no older than 8 mix shades of green and cobalt blue. The kids had no idea who Margaret Hale was, not really. To them, this place was just the house with the cool paint smell. But they listened when Olivia spoke. They leaned in when she dipped her brush, and they grinned when she let them smear streaks across the practice canvas. Outside the wide front windows, sunlight spilled across the newly scrubbed floors. The old gallery space had been transformed, no longer filled with silent walls of expensive pieces, but with mismatched chairs, open sketchbooks, color-stained aprons. A school in the purest sense, free, welcoming, needed. It had been Olivia's idea. They could have sold the house, could have sold the paintings. Offers had poured in after the live stream. Galleries wanted retrospectives. Museums offered commissions. A private collector from New York had reportedly offered $3.4 million for the patched portrait alone. Margaret had turned it all down. Let them hang on the walls where someone can touch them, she'd said. Where someone who's never held a brush might look up and believe they could. It was Olivia who wrote the grant letters. Olivia who worked with the shelters. Olivia who met the children on Saturdays and taught them that color didn't have to be expensive and lines didn't have to be perfect to mean something. Olivia who took the memory of abandonment and turned it into belonging. Margaret sometimes just stood and watched her, not as a ghost from the past, not as a mistake she couldn't fix, but as a miracle she'd been allowed to meet again. That morning the studio smelled like linseed oil and lemon cake. The latter thanks to Mrs. Dent from down the street who'd brought a tray to welcome the kids. Margaret walked slowly to the center of the room where the main wall stood bare, or rather it had stood bare. Now it held only one piece. The portrait, the original, the patched one, hung in a handmade oak frame, no velvet rope, no security glass. It hung where every student could see it, where the wound was visible but so was the repair. Below it in charcoal gold script, Margaret and Olivia Hale. The signature wasn't just paint anymore. It had become their bond. A second birth certificate. A contract. A confession. A redemption. Margaret ran her fingers along the bottom of the frame. Behind her, Olivia finished guiding the children to clean their brushes, then walked over. No words were exchanged. They stood side by side, gazing at the canvas they had mended with hands in history. "You know," Olivia murmured, "some of the kids asked me today if you were famous." Margaret chuckled. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you used to be," Olivia said. "But now you're just someone who shows up." Margaret looked sideways. "Is that better?" Olivia nodded. "Much." The door opened again. This time it was a teenage boy, maybe 15, who stepped inside. His clothes were a little too big. His shoulders hunched from years of moving through spaces, like he was trying not to take up too much of them. He carried a folded sketch under his arm. "Are you the ones who teach here now?" he asked quietly. Olivia stepped forward. "We are. You want to join?" The boy hesitated. "I'm not good." "Neither are we," Margaret said deadpan. The boy smiled and stayed. As the room filled again, Margaret stepped back, watched the brushes fly, the laughter rise, the pages turn. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel like a fraud in her own house. She felt like part of the foundation. Later that day, after the last child left, and the sun had dipped behind the steeples of Charleston, Olivia closed the studio windows and pulled the blinds. Margaret made tea in the old copper kettle. They sat at the small round table in the corner, paint still on their hands. "I got another offer today," Margaret said casually. "For what?" "For the portrait. Same collector. Doubled his bid." Olivia raised an eyebrow. "You tempted?" Margaret sipped her tea. "No." "Why not?" Margaret gestured toward the wall. "Because he offered money. And that painting has already been paid for with everything I had." Silence settled. Comfortable this time. Olivia reached into her satchel and pulled out a sketch pad. Flipped to a half-finished sketch. It was of two women, older, weathered, leaning against each other. Below it was a title in pencil, "After the Fire." Margaret's eyes lingered. "I like the way you gave us laugh lines," she said softly. "Well," Olivia said, "we've earned them." They smiled. And then the power flickered, a summer storm forming on the coast, likely. But neither woman moved to light candles. They were fine in the dark. They had each other now, and that light at long last was enough. The courtroom was neither large nor impressive. Just beige walls, cracked linoleum tiles, and the humming buzz of overhead lights that refused to stay silent. But the tension inside was electric. Ethan Whitmore sat at the defendant's table, arms crossed, his designer blazer, unable to mask the sweat collecting under his collar. His face, once smug with practiced charm, now looked hollow, as if the scaffolding of lies he'd leaned on for years had finally collapsed. Across from him, Olivia Hale adjusted the microphone. The court clerk had just sworn her in. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when it came, was clearer than she'd expected. "He offered to buy my mother's paintings," she said. "He knew I wasn't legally her heir. He didn't care. He asked me to forge her signature, promised a payout, and threatened to blackmail me if I refused." Murmurs rolled through the gallery. Olivia didn't flinch. "He wasn't interested in art," she continued. "He was interested in ownership, in leverage, in the illusion of legacy he could sell by the inch." Ethan looked up sharply. Olivia didn't look at him. She looked at the judge. "I came here to punish my mother," she said, her voice softening. "Instead, I learned the difference between inheritance and creation, and I choose to create." The judge nodded once. Outside, reporters clustered behind barricades. A verdict wasn't delivered that day, but word spread quickly. By week's end, Ethan was charged with art fraud, attempted extortion, and obstruction. His gallery license was revoked. His name, once printed beneath champagne-stained press releases, became a cautionary tale in Charleston's cultural circles. But Olivia didn't celebrate. She went back to Hale House and taught her Saturday class like any other week. She didn't speak about the trial again, and neither did Margaret. Instead, they turned to something greater. The Charleston Civic Hall hadn't hosted an art event in nearly a decade. But when the organizers of the annual Art and Healing Symposium invited Margaret Hale to speak, they did not expect her to accept. She did, with one condition. "No stage," she'd said. "I want to speak from the floor, with everyone else." That morning, the place filled early. Students, teachers, survivors, therapists, people who believed in color long before they believed in themselves. At the center of it all stood Margaret, cane in hand, wearing a simple linen dress and paint-speckled shoes. She began without preamble. "I've spent most of my life painting what I couldn't say," she said. "Faces I forgot, places I imagined, people I feared I'd never see again." She paused. A hush fell over the room. "There was a time," she continued, "when I believed art could cover truth, beautify it, blur it. But I was wrong." Olivia watched from the back row, arms crossed loosely, expression unreadable. "No truth stays hidden forever," Margaret said. "And when it returns, whether in anger or in tears, it demands to be met, with open hands, or not at all." A few in the crowd blinked back tears. Margaret looked down briefly, then straight ahead. "If you are an artist," she said slowly, "you're also a historian of your pain, your joy, your silence. Don't hide it, not even the ugly parts." Applause didn't erupt, it built, soft at first, then insistent. When Margaret sat down, she did so beside Olivia. They didn't speak, but Margaret reached over and took her hand. The sun fell over Charleston like honey that evening, thick gold and slow. By the banks of the Ashley River, where the tide whispered against old stones, two easels stood side by side. Margaret dipped her brush into a pale amber hue. Olivia selected a muted lavender. They painted in silence, not because there was nothing to say, but because words had finally been outgrown. Margaret's strokes were soft, deliberate, the kind of marks that came from knowing you didn't need to prove anything anymore. Olivia's were sharper, bolder, but each stroke curved slightly to echo her mother's. Together they recreated the sunset, not exactly as it was, but as they remembered it, as they chose to remember it. A blend of forgiveness and fire. A mix of surrender and resolve. At some point, Margaret glanced over. "You're getting faster," she said. Olivia smiled faintly. "I've had a good teacher." They kept painting. Across the river, the street lamps flickered on. Behind them, the Hale House lights glowed softly. Windows open, music playing faintly from the back room. The painting neared completion. A sky almost finished, a reflection still in motion. And in the quiet closing seconds of that golden hour, Margaret laid down her brush. She looked over at Olivia. "I never thought I'd have this again," she said. Olivia met her gaze. "You never lost it." They both turned back to their canvases, and just before the final stroke, Olivia whispered, "You ready?" Margaret nodded. Together they signed the canvas, side by side, just like before. Margaret and Olivia Hale, final frame. The painting rests on a wooden bench beside the river. The camera pans upward, catching the orange sky, the trembling trees, the quiet breath of two women finally at peace. And as the image fades to black, words appear in handwritten script. "Family is not where we are born. It is where we choose to forgive and begin again."